Thanks everyone for coming today. I'm Matt Seeger. I'm chair of the Department of Communication, and you have probably only met me before if you've won an award or had a complaint. Occasionally, we have a very unique opportunity to bring back to campus former students who've gone off into the larger world and had exceptional success. These visits are really wonderful treats for us because they allow us to hear how the Wayne State experience translates into professional success, rewarding careers, and impact at the national and international level. Well, life is a box of chocolates, and we have one of those treats today. David Salzman is a real live, honest-to-goodness Hollywood producer and a graduate of this program. He received his master's degree here in 1969. Some of you students here may have read about 1969. It was a very exciting time in Detroit and in the media industry. Media was really taking off in this market, and there were lots and lots of opportunities. Mr. Salzman came here based on the recommendation of one of his teachers at Brooklyn College, where he earned his undergraduate degree. So the first thing we can learn from Mr. Salzman's visit is that you should always listen to your teachers. He came to Wayne State on a graduate assistantship that required 20 hours of work a week. For some of you that may be familiar. So of course, like any good graduate assistant, he worked 50 hours a week. The second lesson we can learn is that some things haven't changed much in 40 years. While at Wayne State, he started the first university television program, which produced a number of weekly programs for WTVS Channel 56. He also edited the monthly WDET FM radio guide, and he won many awards for these activities and other activities, including a local Emmy. During the 1967 newspaper strike, he produced a 1-hour daily live newscast show from 7 to 8 on Detroit Public Television with Wayne State University students. He was forced to move very fast because the first show was produced with 1 day's notice. As he noted, perhaps for the first time ever, a university with an undergraduate production crew put a first-rate nightly newscast onto the network airways. So a third lesson we can take from Mr. Salzman's career is that you have to be ready when opportunity knocks. With this great real-world experience under his belt, David went on to create and to produce an amazing wide array of shows. As studio chief at Lorimar Telepictures, he created, developed, or supervised more than 200 TV series, including Dallas, Knots Landing, Love Connection, and The People's Court. He is currently producer for the highly rated and my 15-year-old son's favorite television show, Mad TV, now in its 13th season. Now let me just briefly introduce Juanita Anderson, who will be our anchor this afternoon for this program. Juanita is an assistant professor in the department and an independent producer. Before coming here, she was also a producer at Detroit Public Television and at WGBH in Boston. She teaches both the director's workshop and the producer's workshops here, as probably many of you know. I also want to thank Professor Joel Silvers, Tom Hopkins, Gary Sendrowski, and all the crew for this afternoon's production. Before we commence with the questions, I need to just dispel a couple of rumors. Despite what you may have heard, Mr. Salzman is not here to scout out talent for a new reality TV show, America's Next Top Student Filmmaker. So please don't overload him with scripts and DVDs. Mr. Salzman is not here looking for talent for the next Mad TV show, so no sketch comedy routines during the presentation, please, although some of you facing finals may need a little comedy in your life. But please give us a very warm Wayne State welcome to David Salzman. Thank you.
And welcome to everyone who's here. Disclaimer first, because neither David and I are comfortable in front of cameras, so we're just going to pretend that they're not here. We're used to working behind the scenes. We're going to open it up to questions from students, but before I'll probably have a couple of questions. Just a couple of notes and introductions I'd also like to make for many of you who have not had the opportunity to meet them. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dean Sharon Vasquez, who's the Dean of the College of Fine Performing and Communication Arts. Dr. Hai Goshagan, who is the Director of the Media Arts and Studies program. And Dr. Kim Piper-Aiken, who is the lead faculty member in our new broadcast journalism curriculum. And of course, Joel Silvers, who many of you know, who I have to give a very special thanks to for his major work in producing this event today, along with Tom Hopkins, who's in the booth. So let's get started. I have a question based on last night, and I should mention to you all that the Ovation Awards are a really big deal. And David Salzman not only won our Distinguished Alumni Award in Communications, but he won a Career Achievement Award for your work in the field. So congratulations once again.
Thank you.
I have a question based on what I've learned about your experience at Wayne State University, because it seems to me that here you already had the makings of becoming an outstanding producer. And is it self-confidence, audacity, a combination of both? What does it take to be a good producer? And can you answer that question by recounting the story of your work with the '67 newspaper strike?
Sure. For me, the secret ingredient was ignorance, I think. Literally not knowing what I was undertaking, and thinking I was going to become a producer, and what it entailed, and kind of learning, in the trial by fire type of thing. The experience that first of all, let me say I'm very happy to be here. In life, it goes, as each decade goes by, it moves with twice the speed as the prior decade. The older people in the room will know that this sounds like it's not true. I think it's fact. And so, I remember when I was the student and some old dude would come by and talk about things that I either didn't care about or never heard of. But, so it does go by very fast. And I was very happy to get those awards. Although, as I mentioned last night, I was among the many different associations I've had in my career, and everything is collaborative in this business, and that's sort of being less facetious about what it takes. I mean, you need to be able to work well with people. As you're a producer, you have to have a vision of what you want the end product is. It's a little like back timing in production. You see it, you feel it, and you're the only one with that roadmap, and you're working backwards, and you need all those elements. But I was mentioning one of my partners for a number of years, and a much more illustrious person, Quincy Jones. So I got 2 awards last night, but I've been with him when he's walked away with 6. So it's one should never take anything too seriously when it comes to getting an award. I also, as I mentioned last night, I've always been one of those lucky guys that just sort of walks down the right street at the right time every once in a while. I think if you walk 10 miles a day, you have more of a chance of succeeding than if you walk 1 mile a day. And I think a lot of success in any business, particularly in production, is just not talking it, it's doing it. So when we were here at Wayne State in the turbulent 60s, I got here in September of '65. Had never left New York, had no money, came with about $50 plus my assistantship, proceeded to lose 40 pounds in 4.5 months because I was eating 1 meal a day, and I also developed a bleeding ulcer. But it's a tough way to lose weight. So, I mean, in spite of all of that, it was just so much was happening on this campus and all around that you just had to sort of walk around with your eyes open, and there was plenty of material out there. And the attitude was sort of a why not attitude at Wayne State. So when in 1967, way back in the old days, there was a newspaper strike back when newspapers were the primary source. Television was emerging as the #1 news source, but newspapers were a big deal. And so we had a newspaper strike here in Detroit, and it ended up lasting 8 months. Most people thought it would last more like 8 days. So it started on a Monday, and I decided that I would make a phone call on a university phone, and I called the Ford Foundation out in Dearborn, and I called this guy, Fred Friendly, who most of the young people would maybe only know from Good Night and Good Luck, the George Clooney movie, but he was the president of CBS and pretty much the father of modern television news. Started in radio with Edward R. Murrow and Cronkite and all these legends of the distant past. And he happened to be in town that day. I thought he worked here, but he just happened to be visiting Detroit. And I said, hey, we're at Wayne State. We've got these professional studios. We've got access to the airwaves. We can't leave Detroit in this news void. You see the garbage that's on local television. We can mount a real newscast. We'll do a newspaper on the air, which I don't think anybody's doing. what do you think of that? And of course, he thought it was a great idea, being, you know, a newsie himself.
See, I told you audacity.
Yes, so it's, you know, it's the luck, timing is everything. So he came that afternoon we were at 5035 Woodward, which is next to the Maccabees building, and that what was then a very nice old building. And we walked over there, and he said, you know, we'll give you the funding if you can really mount this thing by tomorrow, but you got to mount it tomorrow, and you can't embarrass the Ford Foundation. So I said, well, you know, we don't want to embarrass Wayne State University either, but we won't. So I was running student television, and we took our facilities and virtually an all undergraduate group of people who'd never done live television. And we got the editors and top reporters. I got to pick between the Detroit News and the Free Press, and I was writing freelance articles for the Free Press, so I obviously picked them out of self-interest. And within 24 hours, we were on the air with a 1-hour live newscast, Monday through Friday, for the full 8 months. And we did some really breakthrough things, and we would have, one of the things we did was we would do about an 8-minute interview, and we had, you know, some of the major people who were in Detroit at that time. And this is in the days of Walter Reuther and Jimmy Hoffa and people like that. So we had major newsmakers coming, you know, on campus and doing things, and we did some live music and everything, but it was basically a hard newscast. It was kind of, you know, reading their own stories, and the people were not professional on-air people, but it was very good. And it was one of the many feathers, I think, in the so-called, you know, bonnet of Wayne State.
But then that led to you doing the same thing in San Francisco during their strike, right?
Yeah, what happened was we got this thing on, and I guess, you know, the Ford Foundation, he must have gone back there and said, hey, I met these people at Wayne State, and they said they could do this by tomorrow, and there's like no way they're getting this thing on the air, so you don't have to worry. But we did, and we, as I said, without a hiccup, and it went very well. So then a few weeks later, San Francisco had a newspaper strike, which ended up running about the same length. So he said, well, let's send that task force out there. So I got my second plane ride, you know, to the first time to the West Coast, and we set it up in San Francisco. It ran in San Francisco for 10 or 11 years. By that time, I was head of news for Westinghouse and things like that, so I got to steal people from the PBS station and put them on a station I was responsible for, which was a CBS affiliate, KPIX. So it was, you know, everything, you know, when you're on a lucky roll, one thing leads to another.
Okay, so but talk about this transition from Wayne State to Hollywood, because it wasn't immediate. You did some time at Channel 50, and
yes.
Then how did you make that transition?
Yeah, I'm probably a bad person to talk to students, because I didn't even have low expectations for myself. I had no expectations. So I graduated from college, you know, back in the days when you got a great liberal arts education, and I read fabulous books that necessarily didn't relate to anything in the real world. But I had, you know, a nice book education, and when I graduated, I had no idea what I really wanted to do. And I had always been a pretty good writer, and ran the high school newspaper and the college newspaper and things like that. So I applied to journalism schools, and for some reason got into, you know, what were then the best journalism schools, among them Columbia Journalism and the Medill School at Northwestern, and was planning to go to Columbia, and sort of by accident ended up at Wayne State. And then through a series of other accidents, you know, ended up working in commercial television. Actually, from my Wayne State experience and winning a local Emmy and some other attention, I got a job at Channel 50, which some of you may know was the first UHF independent television station in America, right here in Detroit. And I went out there, and they offered me $50 a week to produce the Lou Gordon Show, which was a controversial political affairs type of show. The guy was very talented, and it turned out to be a great show. But I bargained them up to 100. I thought, like, boy, these guys are dumb, you know. And so at that time, I was a full-time student, and I was working 40 or 50 hours a week here, and I was working sort of another full-time job, but I was, you know, single and had a low sleep requirement, and put about 40,000 miles a year on my car, and was doing all those different things. So, you know, ultimately that led me to being offered other jobs, back in New York where I came from at ABC. I couldn't believe it. And I was offered this job at ABC for 3 times what I was making at Channel 50. So I'm taking this trip to New York and going to return, the return of the native. I'm going to be this big hero working for ABC with a big expense account and a big office, in Manhattan. And there was this other company, Group W, Westinghouse, which I thought was the finest broadcast company and was most tied into the community, did the most original programming. And they had been wanting to get me to go work for them. So they talked me into, on ABC's ticket, to stop off on the way to New York in Pittsburgh. And Detroit at that time was the 5th largest market, according to AC Nielsen. It was New York, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, and then Detroit, and then Boston, and then San Francisco. And so this was, the big time. And for me to go to Pittsburgh, which was then the 9th market, now Pittsburgh is something like the 21st market, was like, why would I do that? I can go back to the Big Apple and, I'm going to do that. But I stopped off at KDKA, which was where the first radio station ever started. And I just sort of fell in love with the town, and it reminded me of Detroit, which I loved and didn't love leaving. And then I went to New York, and I ended up, in my many wise decisions, turned down, a $55,000 a year job to take a $25,000 a year job with more work. And but then that worked out well, because 4 years later they made me, I'd become a general manager. I was still in my 20s. Of the big Philadelphia station that they had, and then I became chairman of their production and distribution company, and then a bunch of other companies at around 30 or 31, which wouldn't have happened for me at ABC, because I don't drink or smoke, and boy, if you couldn't drink and play golf at ABC, sometimes simultaneously, you are not going far.
So, but you're doing news and public affairs, community affairs type programming primarily. How do you make that leap into Hollywood entertainment programming?
Well, at Wayne State, we did, the first open heart surgery program, and I did 300 episodes of a nursing series with the, fabulous nursing school here at Wayne State, and stuff like that. But some of the shows that we did were, stretching to the loosest definition of of what a public broadcasting station or educational TV should be doing. So we had a series that was really like a local Tonight Show, and actually won an Emmy as that. And we had this, I created this show, and I was producing it and doing everything else. And we had a guy who was an undergraduate student who was one of the top DJs in town, but who was also a Wayne State student. His name was Ed Bush, Big Ed Bush, on CKLW, which is this big rock and roll, 50,000 watt AM station.
Based in Windsor.
Based in Windsor, big signal blanketing a very large area. In those days, there was almost no FM. FM was just repeaters or dark or very special interest. And then, of course, by 1970, say 5 years later, FM became the business. So he was this terrific DJ, and we had this show on, and he would work across the river, and he got stuck on the Ambassador Bridge in bad weather and traffic, and we were a live show. We had a house band, and we had fabulous people on the show. Anybody who came to Detroit, I mean, you name it. We had, in fact, on the show that he missed was one, we didn't usually do theme shows. This was the first theme show we did. It was on insult comedy. So we had the forerunner to Jackie Leonard, who was, to Don Rickles, who was Jackie Leonard. And we had a then unknown Joan Rivers, and this guy Phil Foster, who was later on Laverne and Shirley and all that stuff, but was an insult comic, and other professionals. And Ed could not make it. So it's like, what are we going to do? So I went on the air, and that episode got nominated for, I still don't know how, for a local Emmy, and we won the local Emmy. And I won an Emmy as a performer, and I was just filling it. Ed Bush has never spoken to me since, literally. So, we were doing some things that were, not the normal, within the normal purview of so-called, university or educational programs. So it was not a giant leap. And I was doing the Lou Gordon show, and then I was at Channel 50, and they said, well, look, we're having trouble with our kids show for an extra $50 a week. Could you fix the kids show? So we fixed the kids show, and then we created creature features and, I did a casting call and, hired a local, Dracula type guy, and that was successful, and we syndicated that to the Westinghouse station. So, I mean, one of the great things, which I would say would be maybe good advice for people, is when I got into television, it really was in its nascent stages. And I actually got a job. I used to work summers. I worked from the time I was like 11 or 12 years old. Like everybody was going to the beach, I was working. So, and I love to work. Turns out I'm a workaholic, but which I only discovered in recent years. But what I did was I worked a couple of summers for the New York Times. When I was growing up in New York and I was in college, there were 7 thriving daily newspapers, 7. And I was a campus correspondent and a sports correspondent to all 7 at one point in time. So I used to work summers for the New York Times, and then I got a job. I got a job offer from the New York Times when I graduated in a very lowly sort of a job, but it was sort of a big deal because I wasn't an Ivy League guy and my dad wasn't, the CEO. You needed those kinds of, credentials or ins to work at the New York Times. But somehow I was able to, work around it. And I got a job at the New York Herald Tribune where they were going to make me an actual sort of junior reporter. So I took the job at the New York Herald Tribune, which was considered by most people in journalism to be the second best newspaper in America to the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And I was working for these 2 women, and I always, for some reason, found myself working for women and being adopted by these older women. I must have been so pathetic looking and lost. So I worked for this woman who was the education editor for whom I'd done these correspondence stories, whose name was Terry Farrar, who was frequently featured, probably at least once a month on Meet the Press. She was like the writer in that field, and tough as nails lady. And Judith Christ, who was not particularly well known then, who was in radio and TV. She was the assistant editor, and she thought I was great. And so they would take me to lunch, every few weeks and tell me what a moron I was because I was in this moribund business and was right out of, Front Page and George S. Kaufman and things like that, that the industry was going to go away and the paper was going to fold, like maybe they'd not be in business by the time we got back from lunch. So that's when I started, and the university I was going to started to have a program. They got a bunch of young professors from Wayne State, and I took these TV courses like, this is pretty good. I mean, I grew up with TV. I just geez, I guess I know more than I think I know. So that's sort of how I ended up in television because it was a blank canvas. And I'm good with a blank canvas. Not as good with the fill in the numbers and the lines and the color codes. I'm, a little bit too independent a thinker. So, I mean, for me, it was great because it was this brave new industry where you were figuring stuff out. And when you worked at the Channel 50s, who had no money whatsoever, and you came from no money, and you had enough to survive, a bed, and, you could eat out of the vending machines type of thing, then you just took on more and more work, and, you tried to, the success in anything is fulfill the objectives, meet or exceed what's expected, and if you just keep doing that, sometimes you get lucky. So, when you were there in those days, it's like, hey, if you want to work over the weekend, you could write news stories or you could be editing tapes. So you just learned everything and you became the jack of all trades. So it was Wayne State simultaneously with Channel 50, then becoming executive producer for all the Kaiser stations because I was this idiot who worked for next to no money, who was single at the time, who would travel around. So I got to go in and put stations on the air in Cleveland and Philadelphia and Boston and San Francisco and all that stuff. And just one thing led to another. So that's sort of how it happened. And by that point, you build somewhat of a reputation. And that's how Westinghouse found out about me and ABC. And it sort of went on from there.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Laura Marr.
Sure.
And I guess the question that I have, Mr. Blank Slate, is you're responsible for developing major series that are going to get major ratings, and you've done a lot of that. Is there a particular formula that you've evolved over time that says I'm going to take this calculated risk and this is going to be a big hit?
You know, I wish I could cleverly reduce it to that, but to me, it doesn't work that way.
Okay.
I mean, in effect, simplistically, in Hollywood, whether it's TV or movies or whatever, to me, you're either a supplier / maker, producer, whatever. You're either a supplier or you're a buyer. And, you know, if you're really good at selling, because everything in life is sales, you're selling when you don't know you're selling. The really great buyers are the best sellers, because you're always selling even when you're buying. The guy that runs, the CEO of CBS Incorporated, is this guy Leslie Moonves. I hired Leslie Moonves. You know, he was an out-of-work actor who, you know, knew a little bit about TV movies, and got to train him, and eventually he became my right or left hand guy, and then went on to achieve, you know, more than I've ever achieved in my career running this vast corporation. But Les was a great salesman, you know, and that was, you know, why I think, you know, I started with him, and he was a great student and tireless worker and just an amazing force of nature type of guy. And the same with other people who I actually had the chance to work with, or who work for me, like Peter Chernin, who runs News Corp. So, you know, I think what's true, I think if you ask them, they would say there's no formula. But when you're on the selling side, you're trying to figure out what the buyer wants, what you want to do. And in this crazily triangulated business, you're really the ultimate arbiter is the, you know, the American public, which votes through this extremely inaccurate and faulty AC Nielsen rating system. But that's the measurement in the triangle of advertiser-based media. So, you know, you sort of figure out what they say, you hear what the buyer wants, you figure out what they really should be saying to you, which sometimes is the same thing and sometimes is not, and you sell it to them. So if I'm wearing a striped shirt now, and if they, you know, you can sometimes convince them that it's a solid shirt if they want to buy solid shirts. But, you know, so it sort of works from there. You know what I mean? You can't just do breakthrough things at all times. The breakthrough things that I've done for the most part were in syndication, because there you control everything. You know, you decide, you're running the company, and you say, hey, look, I think that, you know, there were all these shows, including Datey Game and Newlywed Game, which are fundamentally embarrassment shows, but they're not real. You know, these are out-of-work actors. No one looks like the blondes that they had on that show, and none of them look like male models in terms of the real public that's out there. And it's fake, but it was fun. But America's ready for the next thing, which in my opinion was Love Connection, which I came up with this other guy that it was, you know, we'll take a Chuck Woolery guy who's great and is a personal friend and a very warm guy, but we'll really send people out on dates. There's this new thing, computer dating. It's 1981, 82. It was pretty new then. And, you know, and we'll do this show that we'll break rule number one of the business. It has to fit into a box. It's not a game show. It's real, but it's not real. It's not a talk show. You know, what is it? So I called it a relationship show. And that's another rule. You know, it's got to be one or two syllables, and relationships is a long word. It just doesn't, it's a relationship. What's a relationship show? So, you know, when you're running the company, you can just will things to happen. And that, you know, that's what we did with that. And then it was pretty good, and it was sort of an instant success, and it ran for about 13 years and still runs and rerun. I could have never sold that to a network. Brandon Tartikoff, who was a legend in broadcasting, worked for me briefly. And we were both promotion guys and received awards together. And he said, I want to work for you sometime, you know, and he was working at WGN, a local station. In those days, a pattern was to work at local stations, because local stations were like little studios. You really produce things. Not the case anymore that I'm aware of. So, you know, Brandon worked for me briefly on the Mike Douglas show. When I say briefly, I mean it was less than 2 weeks. But, you know, so when Brandon heard about Love Connection, he said, it hadn't been on the air yet, he said, I want that show, but you got to make it into an hour. And I want you to, you know, cast this guy and instead of, you know, his guy, who they had under contract, who was terrible. He was a stand-up comic. And I said, I'm not doing it. The show's got to be real. I'm doing it with Chuck Woolery. I don't need you. The network means nothing to me, Brandon. You know, I'm going to make much more money, because if this is a big hit, which is a big thing.
Yeah.
It's sort of ballsy because he was already, kind of a big deal. But I could say that to him because I was offered the job that he had by this guy, Herb Schlosser, and I turned it down, and I recommended him for the job. So it was helpful to his career. So he was always very good to me in buying stuff for me. But, but I could tell him, whatever I thought. And I said, so he said, well, I refuse to let you not sell me the show. And I said, well, let me, give me a pad and paper. And I wrote out, here's what I was projecting the show could do in success. And then I showed him financially what it was worth, that it would throw off, at its maximum, $30–40 million a year in profit in syndication, which was a lot of money in the early 80s, or early to mid 80s. His network license fee, we were going to make $50,000, $75,000 a week on the show. Not bad when you multiply it out over, it's going to be 39 weeks. So I said, what would you do if you were me? Would you bet on yourself for the sure single and have this money, but it could fail and then you could take it off, or control your own destiny by selling it to 180, 200 stations, and if 20 of them don't like it, you replace them with other stations in the market, and in success, I'm going to make a lot of money and my stock price is going to go up, and I own 500,000 shares of my own stock. So he said I would do it myself. So we did. So we did the show. We passed on the NBC offer. But, it was easier to do then than now because I had a very clear vision of what I wanted that show to be. The guy that I had designed the set, which was a great set, and won all sorts of set design awards, went on to be a guy that I then used years later when I produced the Oscars and has done 25 sets on Broadway and everything. So it's really all about people, and if occasionally you have a vision of something, occasionally you write about it, and you can execute, on the vision. When you go through the network business, or you're making a movie, God forbid, with a Hollywood studio, it's going to have 5 rewrites. It's going to bear no resemblance to what you wanted it to be. I mean, I had this book. I was, an English lit major, so one of my favorite books was this book, Their Eyes Are Watching God. I mentioned it to Quincy Jones when we were partners. He said, I know that book very well. I said, well, I've got the rights to that book. I want to do it as a movie.
This is Zora Neale Hurston, right?
Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston. And so Quincy was very friendly with Oprah and still is. So through him, I got to know Oprah. And I mentioned it to her. She had not read the book and wasn't that familiar with, she knew about the Harlem Renaissance and everything, but wasn't that familiar. So we sort of kissed her into our deal. And we were going to do this as a motion picture for Warner Brothers, which Quincy and I had to deal with. So we went through 3 different presidents over a 5-year period of Warner Pictures. We therefore went through 3 different scripts, all of which were vastly better than the miniseries we produced in 2005 with Halle Berry for ABC. And, but by that point, Oprah was now Oprah. And she had her vision, and she had her own stormtroopers who worked for her, and they were, they basically didn't want Quincy or I or any man to sort of touch this work. They had their own creative vision, and they did it their way. And it's very subjective, but that's what you sort of go through, and it's constant compromise, and it's very, very difficult. It's why people occasionally sue to get their name not on credits. But they'll take the money.
We're going to open it up for questions. I think there's a mic right there that people can use. If you can come over to the mic and ask your question.
Hi. Hi, my name is Heather. Is it working? I'm a graduate in journalism, 2004. My question, one question, I have 2. One of them is, how do you keep your sense of humor?
Well, comedy to me is an expression of pain. That's why the most messed up people are comedians and comedy writers. They really are. They just have usually dysfunctional lives, including Judd Apatow, who's sort of the hottest guy in Hollywood right now. But you sort of have to laugh at it because it's so crazy. It's just not a real world. Hollywood is a nutty place, so it's easy to keep your humor. You either have to protect yourself, or it's just so full of lies, deceit, and disappointment that you just you just have to maintain somewhat of a sense of humor.
One question. Is there room anywhere in the comedy world for people with like physical disabilities? I don't see that on like a lot of the comedy shows or really these new reality shows. And I've always thought of like pitching different ideas about the hottest Jerry's kid, like them going out on dates. Has anyone ever come to you and pitched anything for, Gimps Incorporated?
No, they haven't. Although there are shows.
Thank you.
Sure, where there are no tally lights here, so I don't know where I'm talking. I'm going to stay here, but there's we live in this age of political correctness. And like anything, where you're dealing with pendulum swings, it tends to go a little too much in one direction or another. So, since it's advertiser based, I think there's this concern of seeming to exploit people, which seems strange since the media are, become so exploitative, it's ridiculous. So I think it would be a very tough sale. There was a show that a guy I've known for a long time, who's actually, I think, one of the brightest creative people at the television networks, is this guy Mike Darnell at Fox, who himself is a very small person, really small, though not a dwarf, and who's done these crazy, he's the father of, Fox's super edgy, all that, reality stuff of Kids Gone Wild and When Animals Attack, and he did a show with all small people, really small people. And it was kind of a spoof of Real World. And, so it was kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll type of stuff, but with little people, which he thought was really, really funny. It actually was quite funny, but it didn't, it got on and it never made it through its first number of episodes because people say, I have a child with this birth defect, and Fox had to take it off the air. So that's part, because it seems like it's exploiting people.
We have a lot of questions, so we're going to move forward. Matt, you wanted to?
Sure, I was kind of curious, maybe a little bit of follow-up. As I said, one of my son's favorite shows is Mad TV, and there's kind of a line that sometimes gets crossed a little bit with Mad TV, and I'm just wondering, how do you recognize those lines? How do you recognize sort of what is appropriate or what is not appropriate?
Are you talking about ethics?
Well, a little bit about ethics, just a little bit more about appropriateness, and it is I watch the show. It's very, very funny. I really enjoy it. But how do you know where those lines are? How do you make choices? And how do you respond to people when they bring up those lines?
It's actually pretty hard on a show like Mad TV, to be honest with you, because it's sort of a moving line by the day and week. I mean, things that you could have done last week, something happens, you're doing a thing about someone on campus shooting people, which we did a lot in our early years, and after Columbine happened, and then all these other unbelievably terrible things, unthinkable things, Virginia Tech, et cetera, we just don't do that anymore. The answer would be in two parts. The first part is, as I said, there are all these various standards. So you have, in the networks, have standards and practices divisions, which are basically protect your ass divisions. Very tough jobs. And the answer is always no. Like is there more than 1% of risk out of 100%? Let's not do it. So we're constantly fighting with those people. That's who I sit next to at every one of our tapings, the woman, that does that. So they stop you from doing certain things. So the process is very simply that every week we work in 1 week cycles. We do a pitch meeting. We bring in each writer. I'm one of the writers, but we bring in a writer at a time. And we've got myself. I now have 2 other executive producers with me, and we sit there. And we listen to all the pitches, and we say, like of the 7 ideas, and we categorize them so that, we get a little bit of everything. And we say, why don't you work on these 2 first? So then they write them, we read them, and then they make it into a weekly sketch pack, which gets read at a table reading, and in front of a lot of people, including the network, all the people at the network, from the creatives who like, why can't you say the F word on the air, to, the S&P people are like, well, we can't call anybody slanty-eyed, anymore. It's like, well, we did it last week. Well, you can't do it anymore. So we have all of that stuff, and so that's sort of the first category. But then you sort of have to go by your own gut, like what does the audience, really want, and who is your audience? And we're primarily an 18 to 34 audience. We have a lot of 12 to 17s. We have under 12-year-olds watching the show. And then we have some people who are kind of from 35 to 49. Not that no one over 50 watches the show, but it really is more for the children of the people who watch Saturday Night Live. So, our targets are different, and our POV is different. It's more of the underdog winning and sending up authority, and not being day and date, and making fun of pop culture, and doing occasionally really over the line mean stuff and things like that we sometimes regret. So I mean, it ultimately becomes fairly subjective if we can pass all those other filters. But because largely in the internet, instantly, what the feedback is. And sometimes it's something that doesn't seem so funny or is really nasty, and it goes up on YouTube, and after 3 weeks it's had 7 million views, and it's like, well, I guess they like that one. It's, who knows.
Andy.
Do you have any regrets or any pitfalls that you would like to illustrate that people could watch out for when going into media business?
Well, I have tremendous regrets in my own life, including that I didn't. I made a lot of mistakes. Some of which I could have had a full head of hair if I didn't make some of those mistakes, and put sunscreen on and stuff like that didn't seem important at the time. In terms of my industry experience. I've turned down. I turned down being president of NBC when that was a really big job, So I told you I turned down $55,000 to make $25,000. So I've never gone for the money, ever. And sometimes that's really served me well, and other times it was really ignorant and irresponsible, because I got married. And we had a child when I was 24 or 25. So, I mean, you have these other responsibilities, and it changes your priorities, in life. You don't realize when you're young and single that, you can really take risks. So, I mean, my advice would be to believe in yourself, know that there are absolutely no shortcuts. I've never found a shortcut, whether it's driving or in anything. It's just like the shortest distance is not always the straight line between the 2 points, but always be building towards something that you believe in is a worthy goal, whatever that may mean to you, whether it's going to change the world, make you rich, allow you to buy your grandmother a new dress on Mother's Day, whatever it might be, and just have a certain ethical center that you won't cross, because especially if you ever get out to Los Angeles, within the first month, you're going to be tested, and there are just certain things you shouldn't do. And if you shouldn't do it, just don't do it. And people make big mistakes anywhere, not just in LA, because everybody in LA isn't from LA. They're from Detroit and Brooklyn, New York, and other places, and they just go there. And some people make terrible mistakes. So believe in good things, work really hard, know that that there are going to be more tough days than easy days. And I would say always surround yourself with good people who you can learn from. The lucky thing for me was, whether it was those women I worked for at the newspaper, ask lots of questions, figure it out for yourself. Take nothing completely on faith, but and convert that good advice that you get into action, and you'll probably do okay. The best thing you can do is find your own mentors in life. Not at like, hey, will you be my mentor? But, people who believe in you. I was promoted so many times before, had I thought about it, would have ever considered myself to go to the next thing. But people who saw something in me that I never saw, and that's a great thing, to be around people who believe in you, will give you chances, won't beat you up, if you fail. It will protect you and support you, and just go in there and just, go into the batting cage and take those swings every single day. Like never, the great basketball players, they're still going, and they're staying an extra half hour after the shoot around or before. The really, really good ones are never satisfied. Michael Jordan raised the bar every single year. And after the first 5 years, he was doing it to himself. In this industry, whether you're a set designer, a writer, a cue card person, a performer, whatever it may be, I mean, the really good ones just constantly are trying to elevate their game and learn from others and, just take on, new targets and new challenges. For me, if I was the same age that I was, in 1965 when I came to Wayne State University, I would have, I don't think I would be necessarily even looking at television. Although what is television now? Is television you can self-publish and self-distribute? I mean, I'd be looking at the new paradigm for the record business. I'd be looking at, content over wireless devices. That's television of a form. If television is anything that's on a screen, then I would stay in television. I'm saying I would no longer recommend to people that they go work at a local television station and do the kinds of things that I and a lot of other people did, including the Brandon Tartikoffs of the world, hauling cables and, getting people coffee and schlepping around and, hoping that one day a guy gets stuck on a bridge or the news writer's wife has a baby and you get to write some stories for the newscast and they say, hey, you're pretty good at this, why don't you try it again? But I think when you see people who've succeeded and grown in the business, it's actually an amazingly similar story.
We only have about 3 minutes left, but I want to get in at least 2 questions.
I'll give short
Margaret?
answers for a change.
Actually, 3 or 4 questions. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Margaret.
I'll be quick. First of all, I watch Mad TV, and
Thank you.
I'm beyond your age.
When I was young, I did shows for people a generation ahead of me, and now that I'm in that generation, I'm doing things for teenagers. I don't know how that happened, but it happened.
What I was wondering, what is LA's thoughts about Michigan's new enticements? Is there room for another center for film, and possibly that could be Detroit?
Vis-a-vis these new Michigan
and
Texans.
tax enticements.
Well, I mean, Hollywood is losing business in not a dissimilar way to American manufacturers having, basically given it over to China. So Hollywood, I think, will continue to lose production. I've seen it go to New Mexico and at one point North Carolina and Kentucky and places like that. So, why not Michigan? We actually, Sharon Vasquez and myself and others were talking about that earlier this afternoon. I think that Michigan, from what I've seen, could do a better job of marketing itself. I think it's fabulous that Wayne State is going to step up and be a leader once again in something which it's done so many times, and sort of try and be a clearinghouse and connect the parts. A lot of what really works in the business is packaging, and there are packaging agents, but it's a matter of putting all the elements together, which is a lot of what producing is. What do I need to get this movie that I have in my head made and distributed and on screens? And it's, so I do think that Michigan has a shot, but it has tremendous competition, not just from other states. So it's going to be difficult. They're going to have to work to earn the business.
Jacob.
Just a real quick question. What media inspired you most in your younger years, teenage years, young 20s, that have influenced your decisions now in your career?
It was television. When I saw the Nixon-Kennedy debates, I just knew that the political process had changed forever. I'm a major political junkie. I through a freak circumstance, which we'll talk about another time, I'd actually gotten to meet Kennedy and Nixon at the time when they were running against each other. I worked at the first pooled coverage. It was called NES, National Election Service. It was the first network pooling, which was the '64 election. I got to work, and how's this for a coincidence? So 50 top students who were involved in media got a chance to be invited to work out of NBC to do this pooled coverage. And out of a hat, literally out of a hat, we pulled the 50 states, and I got Michigan. So I tracked Michigan that night, and we announced in record time, the results in that election, which was a very interesting election because it was Barry Goldwater against, in the heels of the Kennedy assassination, LBJ, and it was the beginning of the so-called Great Society and everything. At a fascinating time in in modern history. But it was TV and it was largely through politics.
Tamara, do you want to ask your question, or should I? Go ahead. Okay. Since you're doing double duty here in camera and floor direction. Okay, Tamara has a question. It is, what was it like executive producing on the Academy Awards ceremony, and what advice would you give to anyone interested in pursuing a career in live television, such as award shows?
It was, one of the thrills of a career lifetime, at least. I mean, the biggest thrills are, getting married, seeing your kids get born, and all those things really relating around your kids were, probably my entire top 10. My top 10 for, show business, so to speak, or the media would include that show. And it was a really fascinating year that we particularly got to do it, and it was a very fulfilling experience. How do you get to do those types of things? I guess if you probably aim to do it, you'll never get to do it, and if you just do other good work, you probably get a chance. There's very little of that. I mean, basically, if I were to say, if you wanted to really do it, try and find out what production companies do those kinds of programs. Get a job as as a PA or something, the lowest entry-level position, and sort of learn by osmosis and work your way up, and probably in a few years you'll get to be the talent booker or whatever, and you'll learn all the different things, and that's how to do it. It's a very tough living because you never know, you're working as a freelancer, and in between gigs you're starving to death. You could lose the 40 pounds that that I lost doing that, but it's exciting. It's very exciting.
We have time for one more question. Alexia, did you have a question? Oh, okay. One last one. Okay.
Political, the way that the CNNs and NBC are covering the elections. What's your comment on that?
Well, other than the thing you're talking to someone who's seen every debate, and some of them more than once. And I know a lot of the those people, the David Gergens and some of the the better ones as analysts. What do I think about the process or the job they're doing?
Yeah, the drama and how it affects the voter.
Well, I've got to tell you, I'm very, very excited to see a level of engagement among young people in the political process that I haven't seen in the last 20 years. So it's awful that things are so bad that maybe that's part of it, and you've got an African American guy and a woman fighting it out for one of the two political parties. So I mean, it's great to actually hear thoughtful conversation that's not just like Leno's jaywalking thing of what a nation of idiots, which unfortunately is, to me, not too much of an exaggeration. So that is great, and I think part of it has been fostered is that you're seeing this thing. It's been an ongoing reality show. It's sort of like celebrity wrestling to a certain extent. So I think it's actually been very good, and some of the coverage is better than others. It's amazing because there've been like 15 or 20 of these. I don't think any one format has nailed it. It's just, we were talking today, I basically haven't had sleep for the last 2 nights, so I can't even remember the morning from the afternoon. But sometime since I got up early this morning, we were talking about it, and someone was telling me that they were watching the Nixon-Kennedy debates and how long and in-depth the questions were, and the grasp, particularly of foreign relations, that those two men had at that time. Now everything, as you know, is so studied. There are handlers and handlers of the handlers, and like, say this but don't say that. There's all of this wordsmithing and everything down. Like, don't say this because you're going to tick off the Jews or the blacks or the Mexicans or whatever. So you don't get that real honest discourse. To me, the great moments were those gaffes and mistakes where people lost their cool or they took them down a road that they weren't properly trained for, and those were those true moments that have helped certain people shine through for all of you and everybody else. So I think it's been great, a very healthy exercise for America, and I've become so cynical that I'm surprised pleasantly that, that has happened. I hope it continues.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.